You've seen this one in textbooks, in documentaries, maybe even in a college lecture. Native Hawaiians hunted their island's birds to extinction. It's been taught as scientific fact for 50 years. Turns out, there's one small problem with that story. There's no evidence it ever happened. Not a single study, not one peer-reviewed paper, zero. And that's not my opinion. That's what researchers at the University of Hawaiʻi just proved. And the implications are bigger than birds. Here's what we're dealing with. A narrative that blamed indigenous people for ecological destruction, taught in schools, cited in papers, repeated for decades. No one checked if it was true. For 50 years, the assumption just sat there, unchallenged, written into the scientific record like it was carved in stone, until January 2026, when a team of researchers finally asked the obvious question, where's the evidence? Let's rewind. The story goes something like this. Polynesians arrived in Hawaii around 1,000 years ago. Shortly after, bird populations crashed. The conclusion seemed obvious. New people arrived, birds disappeared. Must have been hunting. Case closed. Except, that's not how science is supposed to work. Correlation isn't causation. Just because two things happened around the same time doesn't mean one caused the other. You'd need actual evidence. Bone deposits showing mass hunting, archaeological sites full of bird remains, written accounts from early observers, something concrete. But here's the thing. When researchers at the University of Hawaiʻi went looking for that evidence, they couldn't find it. It doesn't exist. The study was published in the journal Ecosphere in January 2026. The researchers conducted a comprehensive review of all available scientific literature on Hawaiian bird extinctions. Their conclusion? Quote, even where there is zero scientific evidence to support it, the myth of Hawaiians hunting birds to extinction took root and for decades has been taught as if it was scientific fact. Let that sink in. 50 years of textbooks, countless citations, an entire generation of students taught something that had no actual scientific backing. So what actually happened to Hawaii's birds? The researchers found three main culprits, and none of them were native Hawaiians with hunting spears. First, climate change, not the modern kind, ancient shifts in temperature and rainfall that altered habitats long before humans arrived. Some birds were already in decline. Second, invasive species, rats that arrived on European ships, mongooses introduced in the 1800s, mosquitoes carrying avian malaria. These predators devastated bird populations. Third, land use changes after European contact. Wetlands drained for agriculture, forests cleared for plantations. The habitats birds depended on were systematically destroyed. And here's where it gets really interesting. The study found that now endangered waterbirds were probably most abundant just before Europeans arrived. Not despite native Hawaiian presence, because of it. The study specifically notes that wetland management was a core aspect of Kanaka, iwi society. Those managed wetlands, the loʻi kalo where taro was cultivated, created perfect habitat for waterbirds. The birds thrived in an engineered landscape. This wasn't coincidence, it was stewardship. Traditional Hawaiian resource management practices actively supported biodiversity, not destroyed it. So how did we get the story so wrong? How does a myth without evidence become accepted science? The answer involves something researchers call assumption-based narrative. Someone makes an assumption that fits existing biases, it gets published. Other researchers cite it. Before long, it's treated as established fact, even though no one actually tested it. The assumption in this case, that indigenous peoples everywhere were primitive, destructive, incapable of sustainable resource management. It's a colonial narrative as old as colonialism itself. And it wasn't just Hawaiian dye. The same pattern appears in scientific narratives about indigenous peoples in Australia, North America, South America. Blame the natives for ecological collapse, usually to justify taking their land. The logic, such as it is, goes like this. If indigenous people were already destroying the environment, then colonizers couldn't have made things worse. It's a convenient excuse. But the evidence tells a different story. In Hawaii, bird populations remained stable or even increased under indigenous management. The crash came after contact. After 1778, after Captain Cook arrived, everything changed. Foreign diseases devastated the human population. Traditional land management systems collapsed, and with them went the birds. The timeline matters here. Pay attention to when things actually happened versus when they were blamed on indigenous peoples. Rats arrived on European ships in 1778. Mongooses were deliberately introduced in 1883 to control rats, which backfired spectacularly. Mosquitoes carrying avian malaria established in the 1800s. Each of these invasive species decimated native bird populations. They ate eggs, they killed chicks, they spread disease, and none of them were here before European contact. Meanwhile, traditional Hawaiian wetlands were being drained for sugar plantations. By the early 1900s, most of the loʻi kalo that had supported waterbirds for centuries had been destroyed. So let's review. Native Hawaiians cultivated wetlands for 1,000 years. Birds thrived. Europeans arrived with rats and diseases. Land management collapsed. Birds died. Yet somehow, the narrative that took hold was Hawaiians hunted the birds to extinction, with no evidence, for 50 years. The study's authors are clear about what this means. Quote, "The findings contribute to growing evidence that indigenous stewardship represents the best approach for native birds to thrive." So what can we take away from this? First, and this one's important, consider questioning scientific consensus that conveniently blames marginalized groups without primary evidence. It's worth asking, who benefits from this narrative? Science doesn't exist in a vacuum. Historical context matters. Power dynamics shape what gets studied and what gets assumed. Next time you hear a claim that's been accepted for decades, try checking when the evidence was last reviewed. 50-year-old facts can be completely wrong. Remember, correlation isn't causation. Just because two things happened around the same time doesn't mean one caused the other. Look for the actual mechanism. And here's one you might want to sit with. Indigenous land management practices, often dismissed by Western science, are increasingly recognized as ecologically sophisticated. This isn't just about birds. It's about how bias corrupts the scientific process, how assumptions become facts, how colonial narratives get laundered through academic citations. It took 50 years for someone to check. 50 years for someone to ask, where's the evidence? That should give us all pause. How many other narratives are sitting in textbooks right now, cited hundreds of times, completely unverified? We probably don't want to know the answer. But here's the encouraging part. The correction did eventually come. Researchers did ask the hard question, and the answer is changing how we understand Hawaiian ecological history. That matters. Not just for getting history right, but for getting the future right. Because if indigenous stewardship worked before, maybe it can work again. Conservation biologists are increasingly looking to traditional practices for answers. What did indigenous peoples know about managing ecosystems that Western science overlooked? Quite a lot, it turns out. Managed burns, rotational harvesting, habitat creation through agriculture, techniques refined over thousands of years. The Hawaii case study is part of a larger reckoning, a growing body of research showing that indigenous peoples worldwide developed sophisticated conservation strategies. Strategies that colonial science dismissed, ignored, or actively suppressed. And then blamed indigenous peoples when ecosystems collapsed under colonial management. The pattern is remarkably consistent. Indigenous management, stable ecosystem, colonial disruption, collapse, blame the indigenous people, repeat for 500 years. If you found this useful, consider subscribing. We cover stories like this every week, cases where the accepted narrative doesn't hold up under scrutiny. The takeaway here isn't just about Hawaiian birds, it's about how we evaluate any historical claim, especially ones that reinforce existing power structures. Ask yourself, does this story conveniently absolve colonizers? Does it shift blame to indigenous peoples? And most importantly, what's the actual evidence? In the case of Hawaiian birds, the answer was, there wasn't any. Zero evidence, just assumptions that went unchallenged for half a century. That's the power of assumption. Once something gets written down and cited enough times, it becomes true by repetition rather than evidence. The researchers who conducted the study deserve credit for asking the obvious question, for challenging a narrative that had become comfortable, for doing the work, and for publishing results that some people won't want to hear, because correcting the record means admitting that science got it wrong. That takes courage. So, that's the story of Hawaii's birds, not hunted to extinction by indigenous peoples, but victims of colonial disruption. The science is now clear. The only question is how long it'll take for the textbooks to catch up. If the last 50 years are any indication, we shouldn't hold our breath. But maybe this time, it'll be different. Maybe now that the truth is out, it'll actually stick. We can hope, right?